Hello everyone, this is Madison from Josefina Sienna with Felicity Merriman. Josefina was my very first American Girl doll in 2006, and Sienna is my first Our Generation doll that I received in February 2022 that inspired this entire channel. You know how we were talking about the memes of American Girl doll where it says we need a doll that does a particular event or sport or hobby that has been going around social media? Well, I've made a meme myself. So I made this meme off a pic collage saying a Chinese American historical doll that discusses Chinese Exclusion Act. And as we know, the Girl of the Year, Corrine, is Chinese American. I think at this point, to have a representation for every American within the United States, I think it's injustice that American Girl has not released a main character historical doll. We received Julie, but we never received a main character historical doll of Asian descent. I realized I said Julie as the Asian historical doll. It was actually Julie's best friend, Ivy Ling. And Ivy Ling, according to the 1970s with Julie, is struggling with her two identities, being a second generation Chinese American. So for me personally, I do not own Ivy, and that is probably one of the regrets that I have in my collection because she has been the one and only historical doll in American Girl, and as of now, she is retired, so you can't even order Ivy Ling. You can't purchase her in the American Girl store as she has been retired. And I find this so infuriating because she is the only American Girl historical doll, but she was a side friend to Julie. Julie and Ivy do have a movie on Amazon Originals. I personally haven't seen it yet as I do not have Amazon Prime, but I also like this visual photo that I found of the Chinese New Year, or Lunar New Year, I should say, is not just exclusive to the Chinese. But it would have been nice to have some type of cultural book with Ivy explaining the Lunar New Year, because most Americans don't know about Lunar New Year. That's not a major holiday that we experience, and so something historical about American Girl, that could have been a huge marketing point to understand different ethnic groups of the American girls that we make up in our American Girl population, because it's not only just Caucasian or I can't even say it, white American girls. I apologize for that mispronunciation, but yeah, it's just there needs to be more representation within American Girls, especially with our Asian Americans. And I am not Asian American myself, but I cannot imagine how our Asian American community feels with the lack of that representation. So this is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. I will be talking about the San Francisco riots, as well as Tacoma and Seattle. I could go long on the history, talking about the discrimination of our Chinese Americans that were not commonly taught in our history. I haven't even been learning about this until now at the age of 27, but this is why I advocate for a Chinese American girl doll who represents the Chinese Exclusion Act and the discrimination of Chinese Americans in the 1800s. I wanted to put this disclaimer that I am still growing myself and learning about this historical events, because unfortunately within our own educational system, we're not taught a lot, or I wasn't taught a lot, about the anti-Chinese discrimination within the 1800s. I don't know about your American history classes, but mine mainly talked about World War II and the Japanese internment camps and that type of discrimination against Asian Americans, but nothing about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I really think that this Exclusion Act really influenced our anti-Asian sentiment during World War II as well. And unfortunately, I am an advocate for history, And I think that if we don't educate ourselves in historical events, then history is just doomed to repeat itself. Unfortunately, with the Stop Asian Hate movement, it seems like it's just a repeat of history with the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the 1800s due to the lack of education within our systematic educational systems that have failed us to educate on our history of our new country. I wouldn't say new country, but current events does replay itself in history when history is not taught. And so I'm just going to have this discussion here about the Chinese Exclusion Act and why I think it's really time that American Girl, as although we do have Corrine Tan, it shouldn't have taken until 2022 to have a Girl of the Year who is of Chinese origin, and it's not just Chinese either. I would love to see like a Vietnamese American during the Vietnam War, as well as a Korean American during the Korean War. But I have some historical facts of why it's so construed, of why we lack the representation of Asian American history. And I think for me, I've learned a lot of new facts just looking into the Chinese Exclusion Act. Specifically, I'm only going to be talking about the San Francisco riots as well as Seattle and Tacoma, but there is a whole discussion about the Chinese Exclusion Act and why it was so problematic, but I don't think it should continue to be swept under the rug. And I think this could be a good sentiment of continuing that alliance with our Chinese Americans after Corrine to release a Chinese American with the Chinese Exclusion Act historical doll. I wasn't aware of this until prior to filming this video because I was only educated on the Great Depression, but in the 1870s there was another depression called the Long Depression, and it almost lasted the entire decade of the 1870s. 20% of unemployment of the men, because at that time women couldn't work, and downward mining stock, and then in San Francisco 200,000 residents lived in the city and only 10% were Chinese. So according to Wikipedia, it said the Daily Atlanta, California covered Pittsburgh's railroad strike of 1877, describing the striking workers and soldier fight. The afternoon rumored of a meeting at 7:30 p.m. with the Working Men's Party of the United States to discuss the labor movement and unemployment rights of the workers. City employees granted access at San Francisco City Hall for the meeting. It was under construction and in a partnership of the San Francisco Public Library. Prior to the start of the meeting at 7:30, there were rumors about arsons at the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which was a transportation port of immigration workers of China between China and the United States. So basically for our Chinese Americans to go back from China to the United States. Leaders of the Working Men's Party promised no threats or violence or foul language. Nearly 8,000 people showed up to the socialist meeting. Chairman James Darcy stated, "This is not an anti-Chinese." It used a C-word name that I refuse to use in my video that they used to call the Chinese Americans, but they said this is not an anti-Chinese meeting. However, the Daily Atlanta, California stated that Dr. O'Donnell had a hobby of having anti-Chinese sentiments and caused the riots to erupt in anti-Chinese language and hatred within the meeting, even though James Darcy stated that it was not an anti-Chinese meeting. Although Darcy did claim that it was not anti-Chinese sentiment, Dr. O'Donnell kept going on and revoking the crowd and speaking up on their anti-Chinese sentiment, which later turned into a 2-day riot of the burning of the port and allowance of the Chinese Americans access to China between the United States. This occurred between July 23rd until July 25th, 1877. During this time of all these riots, the Chinese Americans were fighting for a 8-hour workday as well as equal pay to their white counterparts in manufacturing of these railroads. The Chinese Americans ended up doing the most laborious and most dangerous part of the jobs in constructing the railroad, with only about a half, from what I read online, it was varied from 1/8 to 1/2 of their white co-working counterparts. But at the end of the riots in San Francisco, it concluded 4 deaths of Chinese Americans and 100,000 damages of property damage of Chinese immigrants. Before I go into the Tacoma and Seattle riots, I'm going to give a little bit of a history background of why this Chinese Exclusion Act was made. So during the Central Pacific Railroad, there were Chinese workers as well as European descent workers, and basically these railroad companies called the Chinese just cheap labor. And then I have a quote that says, the newspaper condemns workers who were pro-Chinese. So any company that were with the alliance of Chinese Americans were condemned publicly by public newspapers. In 1882, the Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, only U.S. law to ever prevent immigration and naturalization of a particular race. Chinese men were permitted from marrying outside of their race. So since I'm talking mainly about the western states, the southern states allowed Chinese men to marry outside their race. And I found this on Wikipedia, which isn't the greatest source, and I will link it down below. But I thought it was really interesting how, similar today with Roe v. Wade, the division of states and their ideologies, the same is occurring with the Chinese Exclusion Act. By 1924, the law barred entries of Chinese Americans, and the only Asians that were allowed into the United States that were the Philippines. Every other Asian ethnic group was denied citizenship and naturalization within the United States, which is so important to discuss today. And I think this is the prime opportunity of why it's so important, of why we should have an American girl talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, because it didn't just affect the Chinese. It wasn't until the 1940s, when the U.S. and China became allies in World War II, that Chinese and U.S. relations improved. In 1943, the Magnuson Act, repealing the 61 year of racial discrimination laws granted against the Chinese and Asians within the Chinese Exclusion Act. Large-scale immigration to the U.S. by Chinese did not occur until 1965. So I'm going to be talking about Ivy Ling. So according to American Girl, and I don't know if this is the reason why Ivy Ling was retired, it said that based on her storyline that she is the second generation of Asian or Chinese American to be in the United States, but according to the historical facts of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there wasn't a large-scale immigration to the U.S. by the Chinese until the 1960s. Not discrediting Ivy's story, maybe her parents immigrated to the United States, or if she was a descendant of this railroad discrepancy, but that was back in the 1800s, so perhaps this is the reason why Ivy Ling was retired, due to the historical inaccuracies. So now I'm going to be talking about the Tacoma Riots. Due to the continuous rise of the anti-Chinese sentiments due to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, in November of 1885, Chinese Americans of Tacoma, Washington were warned to leave the city of Seattle. Many of those did take the train to Portland, Oregon, or to Canada outside of the city. However, it wasn't until 1885 that took 2 days to burn to the ground of the Chinatown, which as of today, there is no Chinatown within Tacoma, Washington, and as many as 600 Chinese were dragged out of their homes into the streets and raided out of the city and escorted to the train station. 2 days after the 600 Chinese were kicked out and raided out of Tacoma, Washington, the city of Chinatown was burned to the ground. On February 6th to the 9th of 1886, there was a similar riot as Tacoma in the city of Seattle. The dispute arose when a mob affiliated with a local Knights of Labor formed a small committee to pursue the expulsion of Chinese. The incident resulted in 200 Chinese removal. 2 militiamen and 3 rioters were seriously injured, and the Seattle Chinatown was burned to the ground. Rioters claimed it was an order by President Cleveland. Violence erupted between the Knights and the Labor federal troops. I'm a little hesitant about these historical articles that I'm reading because back in the day with these anti-Chinese Exclusion Act and sentiments, there weren't any reports on those Chinese Americans injured. And with the Tacoma and the Seattle riots, I'm going to be very critical, as well as San Francisco. I'm pretty sure there were some casualties or possibly injured of those Chinese Americans, which should be credited, and perhaps I'll do further research. From my opinion, of course, I'm in the Seattle and Tacoma regions. That's where I'm familiar in history, and I didn't go much in detail about it, and I apologize. I have a whole script of dates and stuff, and that's why it sounds like if I'm reading off a script, because I really wanted to keep these important dates in the video and not lose touch of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is also my first history video. I didn't touch upon any other region besides Seattle, Tacoma, and San Francisco in the Pacific Northwest, but I really hope that we could have a Pacific Northwest representing doll. The only doll that we have is Wang, and Wang is a contemporary character who was also retired by American Girl, which I felt like they shouldn't have retired her because she was a Korean. And although this is talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, as I stated in this video, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented all people from Asia to immigrate within the United States. So this also affected Corrine Tan's family to become an American Girl, because her family probably most likely came within the United States in the 1940s or during the Korean War. But this video is not talking bash of completely of American Girl. I will give him a round of applause that during this Stop Asian Hate movement that Corrine Tan, the Girl of the Year of 2022, is representing our Asian Americans. And I personally don't have Corrine Tan, but I know I am going to save up for her so much. And because this is a historical event for the American Girl company, and I hope that they can just keep moving forward. I also know that in August of 2022, as I'm filming this video, we're going to have another girl of the historical line, Claudie Jones, and representing the 1920s, and she is not a white American Girl doll. She's going to be an American Girl of color, and I am so excited. But I just want to say, like, before I got up an American Girl in 2009, Addie was the only girl of color before getting back into American Girl. But when I got out of American Girl dolls in 2009, Addie was the only historical American girl of color. And I'm really happy to see that I'm back in the community in 2022, that we have Nenea and Melody and Claudie too, and there's gonna be more. I just have a feeling, and this is why I'm making this video. It's a kind of an essay based video, but I wanted to play off these memes. I thought it was a good idea. Like, we need American Girl, and I love them. I am like, because I'm realizing how many other American Girl fangirls like myself are getting back into American Girl in 2022, because I got back into American Girl right before these memes, and I absolutely love them. And they're amazing ideas. Like, these are good, like, note-taking ideas for American Girl for future Girl of the Years, because I personally love them. I saw one of, we need an American Girl who cares about the environment and is an environment scientist, and I love it. I absolutely Now, I know this video was a heavy topic to cover. I wanted to say that in Tacoma, Washington, after the riots, and to bring awareness to the community and to apologize to our Chinese Americans, there is a Chinese recolorization park. And I know that once I get Corrine tan, I would love to do a photo shoot there. I'm not of Chinese descent, so I also am questioning about it, but if you ever come to the Pacific Northwest, I highly recommend visiting or putting it on your bucket list. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope you guys have a great day. I wanted to say that this is my first style of history videos, and I hope to make more. I still am learning about Asian American history, as that's been a main focus of mine since Corrine tan has released. Is I never had that Asian American history, and if you are an Asian American, please comment below of what historical events as someone like me should educate ourselves on, because this is something that I'm really sickening of our society and how it's just been swept under the rug because it absolutely shouldn't have. And I know I left a few details out about these riots of San Francisco, Seattle, and Tacoma, but unfortunately this video is already like 20 minutes long. I could probably make more videos if the public of my audience wants talking more about these events or other history events, but I'm trying to not make a super long video to bore my audience, because these are very heavy topics to discuss for 20 minutes. So make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, and if you made it this far in the video, I appreciate you so much. I apologize for my ramblings as well as cutoffs. I am reading from my script, and this is the first time I've ever read from a script, so it's all a learning curve from here. And if you want to hear more historical facts, personally, I'm learning about Caroline, Cecile Ray, and Mary Grace, because those historical dolls on top of Melody were not around when I was collecting American Girl dolls. So have a great day.